My son-in-law stopped mid-sentence when he saw who was sitting at my workbench. He'd walked into my garage like he'd walked into it 100 times before, keys still in his hand, talking before he'd even cleared the doorway, something about traffic on the interstate. Then he saw Walt Pruitt sitting on my old shop stool, a mug of my coffee in his hand, going through a stack of folders spread across the workbench like he owned the place. Ryan stopped. His mouth was still open from whatever sentence he'd been in the middle of. He said. Hey, didn't know you had company. Walt didn't look up right away. He finished reading whatever line he was on, set the page down carefully, squared its corner against the folder beneath it. Old habit, the same one he'd had for 18 years running numbers with me, and only then said, Afternoon, Ryan. My daughter Claire came in behind him, arms full of grocery bags she'd insisted on carrying in herself, even though I'd told her twice I could get them, and she froze the second she saw Walt too. Not confused froze. Recognized froze. The kind of freeze where the body understands something a half second before the mind catches up to explain it. Dad, she said slowly, setting the bags down on the concrete like they'd suddenly gotten heavier. What is Walt doing here? I took a sip of my coffee. Let the silence sit a beat longer than was comfortable, because I wanted her to feel exactly how long a beat like that can stretch. Having a look at some paperwork with me, I said, That a problem? Nobody answered that. Ryan's eyes had gone to the folders, and I watched him do the math, the way a man does math when he suddenly suspects the math has already been done without him. Claire's eyes had gone to Ryan, then back to me, then back to Walt, like she was trying to figure out which direction the danger was actually coming from. The strange part is, 3 months earlier, I would have given almost anything for the two of them to just stop by unannounced like this. No agenda, no reason. Just to visit the way they used to. Just to sit in my kitchen and eat whatever I'd made too much of. Funny how you get exactly what you once wanted. Except by then the room has changed shape around you. And what used to feel like love now feels like something closer to reconnaissance. Part 1. What I had instead of money. My name is Daniel Osei. I'm 63. I live in a converted barn workshop outside Asheville, North Carolina, on 11 acres my late wife Renata and I bought back when land out here was still cheap and nobody with any sense wanted it. Too far from town, too much slope, a creek that flooded the low pasture every March like clockwork. We bought it anyway, because Renata stood in the middle of that overgrown field on a gray February afternoon, turned in a slow circle with her arms out like a kid, and said, This is it, Daniel. This is the one. I'd learned by then not to argue with that particular tone of voice. I spent 35 years restoring furniture. Not flipping it, not staging it for some showroom photo, restoring it. Real work, the kind where you take a 100-year-old dresser that's been sitting in somebody's leaking basement for 2 decades, strip it down past the water stains and the bad varnish, and the coat of white paint some well-meaning relatives slapped on it in 1987, and bring the actual wood back to life underneath. No franchise, no storefront on Main Street with a cute sign. Just me, a barn, a waiting list that ran 2 years long at its peak, and a reputation that traveled entirely by word of mouth, which in this part of the country still counts for something. When I finally slowed the business down, not stopped, just slowed, because a man like me doesn't really retire so much as renegotiate the terms, I thought I'd miss the noise of it. The radio going all day, the smell of shellac and sawdust. Mostly I didn't miss it, not the way I expected to. I filled my mornings with coffee that didn't need to be finished by 8 o'clock. I took slow walks down to the creek with a thermos and no particular destination. I picked jobs because they interested me, a good piece with real bones to it, not because I needed the check to cover a mortgage payment. The mortgage had been gone for years. I never had money the way people assume antique restorer with a 2-year waiting list means money. I had a full calendar, calloused hands, and a paid-off house on land nobody was building subdivisions on yet. That was the entire fortune, as far as I was concerned. My truck is a 2009 Silverado with more rust than paint on the wheel wells, and it starts every single morning, which is the only opinion I've ever had about a vehicle. Some people spend their retirement trying to look wealthier than they actually are. I never once understood the appeal of that particular exhaustion. Unfortunately, somebody in my family had started doing the math on what I did have. And once you understand that 11 acres in a growth corridor outside Asheville isn't worth what it was in 1994, it's worth roughly 40 times that, according to the county assessor's letter that arrives every January and that I mostly use as a coaster. You start to understand why somebody might start doing that math quietly, in the background, without mentioning it to the person whose land it actually is. My daughter Claire is 41. Sharp, capable, the kind of person who color codes her digital calendar and has strong, specific opinions about email etiquette. She and Ryan live about 35 minutes from me, in one of those developments where every house has the same 4 floor plans wearing slightly different siding, like 4 cousins who all went to the same barber. Ryan sells commercial real estate, office parks, strip retail, the occasional mixed-use development that promises to revitalize some corridor nobody asked to be revitalized. Good at it when the market cooperates. Less good at it lately, from what I'd eventually pieced together, though at the time all I had was a vague, uneasy sense that something in their life had gotten tighter than it used to be. Claire and I used to be close. Fiercely close, actually, especially after Renata passed 9 years ago from a stroke that took her in 11 days flat. No warning, no long goodbye, just a Tuesday morning and then everything after it. Claire was 32 then, old enough that most people assumed she didn't need her father hovering over her anymore, young enough that she absolutely did, in ways neither of us said out loud. For a couple of years after that, we talked almost every day. She'd drive out on Sunday afternoons and sand things badly on purpose on some old chair or table I had going, just to have a reason to stay through dinner. I never corrected her sanding. I liked having her there too much to care about the grain. Then, slowly, and I want to be honest that it really was slow, nothing you could point to and say there. That's the day it changed. The calls got shorter. The visits got rarer. Sunday afternoons filled up with other things. Not a single dramatic moment, not a fight, not a falling out anyone could name. Just erosion, the kind you only notice once you look back over your shoulder and realize how much ground is actually gone, how far the waters crept up the bank while you weren't watching it. At first I told myself it was normal. New marriage. She and Ryan had gotten married 5 years back. A nice enough wedding, open bar, a band that played too much Motown for my taste, but I never said so. New house, new pressures, new job stress, the whole modern machinery of being a working adult with a mortgage and a 2-hour round-trip commute. People get busy. I understood busy. I'd been a busy man myself, once, and I remembered how it could swallow whole seasons without you ever consciously deciding to let it. But then the calls that did still come started having a shape to them that I couldn't quite place at first, and then couldn't unsee once I had. How's the shop doing, money-wise? You still pulling in enough from it? Or is it more just a hobby now? That was one, from a Sunday in October. You still doing your own books? Or did you finally cave and get somebody to help with that? That was another, a few weeks later, dropped in so casually after a conversation about my knee that I almost missed it entirely. You ever think about what happens to all this land someday? Like, in the will and everything. That one landed on a Tuesday evening, out of nowhere, right in the middle of me watching a Panthers game I don't even remember the score of anymore, because the question knocked the whole evening sideways. Small questions, reasonable sounding, even, on their own, the kind of thing any responsible adult child might reasonably ask an aging parent. Until you stack enough of them up in a row and they stop looking like curiosity and start looking like something closer to an inventory being taken, quietly, one line item at a time, by someone who doesn't want you to notice they're counting. Part 2. The first real warning. The call that actually stopped me cold came from an old apprentice of mine, a guy named Theo Marsh, who'd worked in my shop for 6 years before opening his own place 2 towns over. Good hands, better instincts. The kind of restorer who could look at a piece for 30 seconds and already know where the old repairs were hiding under the finish. He called on a Sunday afternoon, ostensibly about a lathe he wanted to buy off me, one I'd been meaning to sell for 2 years and never quite gotten around to listing. We talked shop talk for a good 20 minutes. Bearings, belt tension, whether it was worth rewiring the old motor or just replacing the whole thing. Comfortable stuff. Then he got quiet in a way that Theo doesn't usually get quiet, and he said, "Dan, this is going to sound weird, but you doing all right? Health-wise, I mean." I laughed, told him I was fine, better than fine. Why was he asking? He hesitated in that particular way people hesitate when they're about to hand you something they know is going to hurt. Claire mentioned to my wife, at that furniture show thing back in the spring, that you'd been having some confusion lately. Forgetting things. Repeating yourself. She seemed worried about it. Like, genuinely worried. Not just making conversation. I stood there in my kitchen holding the phone against my ear, and for a second I genuinely thought he had me confused with somebody else, some other Daniel, some other father, some other family entirely. I hadn't forgotten so much as a dentist appointment in probably 6 years. I told him that, plainly, and he said he figured as much, that it hadn't sounded like the man he knew, but he thought I should know what was being said about me, out loud, to strangers. That conversation sat in my chest for days afterward like a stone I couldn't find a pocket deep enough for. Not anger yet. Anger came later, and it came slow, the way it does when you're still hoping there's an innocent explanation you just haven't thought of. What I felt in those first days was something closer to a low, cold confusion, the specific unease of walking into a familiar room and knowing, without being able to say exactly how, that something in it has been moved. A week after that call, Claire phoned, and for the first time in months, she sounded genuinely warm on the line. Asked how I was sleeping, asked about my knee, asked whether the new blood pressure medication was treating me all right. It felt, for about 4 minutes, like getting a piece of her back. Then, almost as an afterthought, dropped into the tail end of the conversation the way you drop a coin into a jar without drawing attention to it. She asked whether I'd ever gotten around to updating anything official. The will, the deed, that kind of thing. Said she knew a guy, an estate attorney a coworker had used, who could come by and just get everything properly organized so nobody had to scramble later. God forbid something happened. I said sure. Come by. Sounds sensible. But something in me had already, quietly, started keeping score. Part 3. Small threads, pulled. I want to be honest about something. For a long stretch of that spring, I didn't go looking for evidence. I wasn't running some private investigation in my own head. I was just a man who'd started noticing things the way you notice a draft in a house you thought was sealed tight. A little more each week, until you finally stop and go looking for where it's actually coming from. The first thread came from Marnie Fowler, a woman who ran the front counter at the hardware store I'd been buying from for 20 years. I was in picking up hinges for a cabinet job when she mentioned, entirely without malice, that Ryan had been in a couple weeks back asking about permitting for outbuilding conversions on rural acreage, specifically asking whether a property with an existing barn structure could be converted to residential use without triggering a full rezoning fight. He hadn't given an address. He hadn't needed to. Marnie just assumed, reasonably, that he was asking on my behalf, since everybody in that store knew whose son-in-law he was. I didn't say anything to her. I paid for my hinges and drove home a different way than I usually take, out past the old mill, just to give myself time to sit with it before I had to be a normal person again in my own kitchen. The second thread came a few weeks later, from my neighbor Gail, who mentioned over the fence that she'd heard, secondhand, through her sister who worked at a bank branch in town, that Ryan's brokerage had lost 2 significant listings that quarter, and that there'd been some talk of a car repossession that had made its way around the neighborhood as gossip before anyone bothered confirming it. None of it was proof of anything. Gail wasn't accusing anybody of anything. She was just talking the way neighbors talk. But I stood there nodding along, feeling something cold settle lower in my stomach than it had settled before. Alone, none of it meant much. A hardware store question, a rumor about a repossession, a daughter asking about wills. Stacked together, though, they started forming a shape I badly didn't want to look directly at. The way you don't want to look directly at a shape moving at the edge of your vision, because looking at it makes it real. Part 4. Walt. That's when I called Walt Pruitt. Walt wasn't some mystery figure from my past, whatever Claire's face suggested in that frozen first second at the workbench. Walt was my old business partner, my only real business partner, for 18 years, back when the shop was big enough to run commercial restoration contracts for hotels and historic properties and needed 2 sets of hands and 2 sets of eyes on the books to keep it honest. Walt was the person who knew my finances, my handwriting, and my habits better than almost anybody alive, because he'd spent 2 decades sitting across a desk from me doing exactly that. Claire, at 19, had decided Walt was somehow untrustworthy. Something about a disagreement Walt and I once had, loudly, over a lumber supplier who'd been shorting our orders, an argument she'd overheard half of through a closed office door and misunderstood completely. That misunderstanding calcified into a suspicion she never fully let go of, even years after Walt retired down to Tennessee, and our friendship reduced itself mostly to Christmas cards and the occasional hour-long phone call about nothing in particular. I called him on a Thursday night in February, not with any plan, just because I needed to say all of it out loud to somebody who'd known me before any of this started. The rumor about my memory, the questions about the deed, the hardware store, the repossession gossip. I wanted someone who knew both the paperwork and the person to tell me, honestly, whether I was building a conspiracy theory out of coincidences or whether I was seeing something real. Walt listened for almost 2 hours without interrupting much, which for Walt is its own kind of alarming, because the man has never in his life gone 2 hours without an opinion. When I finally ran out of things to say, he was quiet for a second, and then he said, "Dan, I think you need eyes on your paperwork that aren't your own eyes. I think you're too close to it." 3 weeks later, he flew in with 1 suitcase and a laptop bag, and he didn't unpack a single thing before he sat down at my kitchen table and asked me to bring him every financial document in the house. Part 5. What the paperwork said. The first thing Walt did was organize. He built stacks, banking, insurance, deed and title, old business records I'd never bothered to shred, and went through each one methodically, the exact way he used to reconcile our commercial accounts back when a math error of $11 could keep him up half the night. The second thing he did was start asking me questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. Who had access to which accounts? Who knew my passwords, or could reasonably guess them? Who'd been present, physically, in the house when certain mail arrived? Who had, in the last year, shown a sudden and specific interest in exactly the kind of information a person would need if they were trying to establish, on paper, that I couldn't be trusted to manage my own life anymore. One afternoon, about 10 days into his stay, Walt was going through a folder of correspondence I'd mostly ignored, the kind of mail that piles up and gets glanced at and set aside. Insurance renewals, HOA notices from a neighborhood I don't even live in but somehow get flyers from, that kind of thing. He stopped reading mid-page, sat very still for a second. Then he said, "Dan, you're going to want to see this." He slid it across the table. It was a preliminary intake questionnaire from an elder law attorney's office in town, not a signed retainer agreement, just the form you fill out before formally engaging someone, the kind of thing meant to get basic facts on record ahead of a first consultation. It asked for the prospective client's name, date of birth, current living situation, and, near the bottom, in a section titled Capacity Concerns, whether the client had exhibited confusion, memory lapses, or difficulty managing financial affairs within the preceding 12 months. The box next to that question had been checked yes. Underneath it, in handwriting I recognized instantly, because I'd watched that particular slant develop since she was 7 years old learning cursive at our kitchen table, was a short paragraph describing specific incidents. A missed utility payment that, as far as I could tell, had never actually happened. A story about me forgetting a doctor's appointment that I remembered attending in full. A claim that I'd become increasingly disorganized with mail and bills. It wasn't signed by me. It didn't need to be. It was Claire's handwriting, top to bottom, describing a version of her father who did not exist. I sat there a long time without saying anything. Walt didn't push. He just let the kitchen clock do its work in the silence, the way he always used to when he was waiting for a client to arrive at a number on their own instead of being told it. Finally, I said, maybe she was just trying to get ahead of something. Cover her bases, in case something ever did happen to me. Walt gave me a look I didn't love receiving. You believe that? I didn't. Not really. I just wanted to, badly enough that I was willing to keep saying it out loud in the hope that saying it would eventually make it feel true. Part 6. The phone call to the attorney's office. Walt called the attorney's office directly a few days later, not to accuse anyone of anything, just, in his words, to ask a couple of clarifying questions about a form that had my old business partner's name on it. He put it on speaker, and I sat across the table with my arms folded, feeling less like a grown man in his own kitchen and more like a kid waiting outside the principal's office for news about somebody else's trouble. The paralegal who answered, a young woman with a careful, professional voice, confirmed that yes, a preliminary consultation had been scheduled on my behalf, based on information provided by my daughter. When Walt asked, gently, what specific concerns had been reported, she read, almost word for word, clearly right off the intake form, the same language we'd already seen. Memory lapses, difficulty managing bills, some vulnerability to being taken advantage of by others. I looked down at my own hands while she talked. Hands that had carved dovetail joints by lamplight for 3.5 decades, that had rebuilt a bell tower's original staircase for a Presbyterian church downtown, that had never once, in 63 years, needed anybody standing behind them making decisions on their behalf. Not the hands of a man anybody needed protecting from himself. When the call ended, Walt sat back in his chair for a moment before he spoke. She may genuinely believe some version of this, he said finally. People can talk themselves into believing almost anything, if it gets them somewhere they've already decided they want to go. That doesn't make it true, Dan. And it sure as hell doesn't make what she's doing with it okay. I spent the next several days carrying that fact around like a stone I couldn't put down anywhere comfortable. I'd be standing at the table saw, hands steady, mind 1,000 miles away, and I'd suddenly think about my daughter sitting across a desk from a stranger describing me as confused. I'd be in the checkout line at the grocery store and think about her asking Theo's wife about my bill-paying habits at a furniture show, of all places, like it was small talk. I kept building her outs in my head, the way I think most parents do, right up until the outs run out of road. Maybe Ryan had pressured her. Maybe she was scared about money and grasping at whatever seemed like a solution. Maybe she genuinely convinced herself she was protecting me from something, rather than positioning herself in front of something. That's what fathers do, I think. We keep hunting for the more forgivable explanation, long after the evidence has stopped leaving room for one. Part 7. Ryan alone. About 3 weeks before the paperwork visit, Ryan came by on his own. No warning call first, which wasn't like him. I was out at the woodpile when his car pulled in, and something about the way he got out of it, too fast, too eager, told me this wasn't a social call. He made small talk for exactly as long as it took him to get a beer in his hand, and then he got to it. Said he and Claire had been thinking a lot about my situation. Said he'd hate for anything to happen where the family ended up tangled up in legal messes because things weren't in order. Said he had a friend, a financial advisor, who could take a look at the whole picture, the shop, the land, my accounts, and put together a plan that would make everything simpler for everybody down the line. I asked him, plainly, what exactly he thought was currently disorganized about my life. He backpedaled a little, said it wasn't about that, it was just being proactive, and then, and this is the part one remember most clearly, because it's the moment something in me went quiet and cold in a way it hadn't before, he said, almost offhand, like it was obvious. I mean, this land's not getting any less valuable, Dan. It'd be a shame for something like that to just sit here not working for anybody. Not working for anybody. Like the shop where I'd built a career, where Renata used to bring me lunch on a folding chair she kept just inside the door, where our daughter had learned to sand a table leg badly on purpose just to stay for dinner, was an idle asset underperforming its potential. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't think about it, not in the way he meant. What I actually did was call Walt that same night and tell him it was time to move faster than we'd planned. Part 8. The real estate question. It was Walt's idea to check the land angle directly, rather than just waiting for it to surface on its own. He had a contact from his old business days, a title researcher named Patricia who did this kind of thing for a living, mostly for banks doing due diligence on commercial loans. He asked her, informally, whether anyone had recently pulled records, requested a survey, or inquired about zoning classifications on my parcel. The answer came back within a week. Someone had inquired, not formally, not through any process that would leave a paper trail with my name attached, but informally, through a broker contact, asking hypothetical questions about a barn property with acreage near Asheville, and what it might be worth converted to residential lots, assuming the existing structure were repurposed rather than demolished. The broker who'd fielded that hypothetical question happened to work at the same firm as Ryan. That was the moment the last piece of doubt I'd been holding on to quietly let go. Not because it was some smoking gun legal document. It wasn't. Not in any way a courtroom would care about. But because it confirmed, finally, without any ambiguity left in it, that whatever was happening wasn't concern dressed up as caution. It was planning. Quiet, patient, methodical planning, built around an assumption that I either wouldn't notice or wouldn't be in a position to object by the time it mattered. I didn't confront anybody that week. I wasn't ready, and more than that, I didn't want the first real conversation about all of this to happen in anger, in my own driveway, with nothing but raised voices to show for it afterward. I wanted something calmer, something undeniable, the kind of moment where the truth simply sits in the middle of the table, in front of enough witnesses that nobody can talk their way back around it afterward. Part 9. The visit with the attorney. That's the visit I opened with. Preston Hale, the attorney, walking in behind Claire and Ryan, and Walt already seated at my workbench with the folders spread out like he'd been expecting company. Claire's face did the thing I described. Froze. Recognized. Recalculated. Dad, she'd said. When did you? She stopped herself before finishing the sentence, but I heard the shape of it anyway. When did you call him? When did you find out? How long have you known? He's been staying a few weeks, I said, helping me get organized. Ryan tried to smooth it over, said they just wanted to make sure everything was buttoned up for me. Nothing to worry about, totally routine. I let him talk. I let Preston open his folder and start walking through the documents in his careful, rehearsed attorney voice. A durable power of attorney, broad in scope, that would give Claire authority over my accounts, my property, and my medical decisions under conditions to be determined, in his words, as needed, based on assessment. Assessment by whom? I asked. Preston hesitated in a way that told me he already knew the answer wasn't going to sound good out loud. Typically the family member who initiated the arrangement, he admitted. I told them I wasn't signing anything that day, or any day soon, until I'd had every page reviewed by my own attorney, one I'd chosen myself, with no connection to anyone in that room. Claire's shoulders dropped, that particular way that told me everything about what she'd been expecting to happen that afternoon and how far short of it we'd landed instead. They left within 20 minutes. Preston looked visibly relieved to go, the way people look relieved to leave a house, where they've correctly sensed they walked into something bigger than the errand they were told they were running. After the door shut, Walt exhaled and said, "Well, that went about as well as I figured it would." I couldn't argue with him. Part 10, the 4th of July. I didn't want a shouting match. I'd had enough weeks of cold suspicion sitting in my chest to know that anger, when it finally came out sideways in a driveway confrontation, tends to leave everybody feeling righteous and nobody feeling honest. I wanted something calmer, and something that couldn't be quietly reframed later as a misunderstanding. So I did what I do every 4th of July. I hosted the cookout. Same as every year, Theo and his family, a handful of neighbors, a couple of old restoration clients I'd become genuinely friendly with over the years, Walt, who I asked to stay through the holiday, and Claire and Ryan, who accepted the invite the moment it went out. That told me something on its own. They still believed the paperwork conversation was simply paused, not dead. They still thought there was a version of that summer where I signed something eventually, once enough time had passed to make it feel less fresh. The day itself was warm, low humidity for once, the kind of Carolina summer afternoon that makes you briefly, foolishly forget August is coming for all of us. I had the smoker going since 5 in the morning, out of habit more than necessity, because Renata always said a man who starts his smoker before sunrise is a man who takes his hospitality seriously, and I'd never found a good reason to argue with that either. Kids from the neighborhood ran through a sprinkler in the side yard. Theo's wife brought a peach cobbler that was gone inside of 11 minutes, and somebody's dog got into the potato salad before anyone noticed, which became the funniest story of the early afternoon. Claire and Ryan showed up around 3, Ryan carrying a case of beer like a peace offering, Claire hugging me a beat too fast and too tight, the kind of hug that's really a scan disguised as affection. I watched her eyes move across the yard while she was still hugging me, cataloging who was there, landing on Walt by the fence line, and going flat for half a second before she recovered her expression. By early evening, most people had eaten. The light had gone long and gold across the field the way it does out here in July, and I figured that was the moment. I tapped my glass with a fork. Not dramatic, just enough to cut through the noise. "Thanks, everybody, for coming out," I said, once the yard had gone quiet. "Before we get into dessert, I want to say a few things, and I'd rather say them now, in front of everybody, than let them sit unsaid any longer." I saw Claire go still, the same stillness from the driveway all over again. "Walt and I have spent the last few months getting my affairs in order," I said. "In the process of doing that, I learned some things I want to be honest about, because at this point in my life, I've decided honesty matters more to me than comfort does." Nobody moved. I kept my voice level, deliberately level, because I'd rehearsed this part with Walt more than once, specifically so it wouldn't come out as an accusation, just as a set of facts laid down one after another. I described the rumor about my memory that had started making its way to old friends and colleagues. I described the intake form, the questions about my mental state, the language about vulnerability. I described the inquiries about the property, the hypothetical zoning question that had somehow found its way to a broker at Ryan's own firm. Claire's face had gone the color of drywall primer. "Dad, that's not," she started. "Which part isn't true?" I asked. Not sharp, just direct, the way you'd ask a supplier to account for a shipment that didn't match the invoice. She didn't have an answer ready. Ryan tried instead, his voice climbing a register. "You're making this sound way worse than it actually was." "Then tell me how it actually was," I said. Silence stretched long enough that even the kids by the sprinkler seemed to sense something and slowed down to watch. Theo had gone very still by the smoker. Gail from next door was suddenly, intensely interested in her paper plate. And then Ryan, under all that pressure, under all those eyes, said the thing that ended any doubt left standing in that yard. Fine, but what happens to the property then? What were we even supposed to plan around? You could hear the creak from where we were standing after that. That's how quiet the yard got. Even the dog stopped moving. Claire closed her eyes. Ryan realized what he'd said about 2 seconds too late. The way people always do. The way a man realizes he's dropped a plate only after he hears it hit the floor, not before. I let the silence sit a moment before I answered. Funny you should ask, I said. Because I already sold it. Claire's eyes opened. What? 6 weeks ago? Quiet sale? To Theo, actually. I nodded toward him, and I watched several heads turn his way, including Claire's, like they were only now noticing he existed as a separate person from the party. Long-term leaseback arrangement, so I get to keep working out of this barn as long as I'm able to hold a chisel, and it stays a working shop instead of turning into somebody's rezoning fantasy. I looked at Ryan when I said that last part. He didn't look back at me. And before anybody starts assuming things, I went on. Walt isn't inheriting a single dollar out of any of this. He's the trustee on an account I set up back in the spring, once all of this started making sense to me. Every dollar of it, once I'm gone, funds apprenticeships, real ones, tools and materials included, for young people who want to learn a skilled trade and can't afford the equipment to get a foot in the door. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Claire's eyes were wet, but her expression had shifted from something defensive into something that looked more like the floor had genuinely gone out from under her, which, in a sense, it had. Why would you do all of that without telling me? She asked, quiet now, all the earlier edge gone out of her voice. Because somewhere along the way, I said, you stopped asking me as your father and started asking me as an asset. And I got tired of not being able to tell the difference anymore. She didn't argue. She just stood there another second or two, and then she and Ryan gathered their things and left without saying goodbye to anyone else at the party. And a minute later, I heard 2 car doors close and an engine pull out of the driveway, and then nothing but the sound of the creak again. I didn't chase them down. I stood in my own yard, in my own fading light, surrounded by people who actually knew me, and for the first time in months, I just breathed. Part 11, The Quiet After. I woke early the next morning. Out of habit, 35 years of shop work doesn't let a man sleep past 6 even deep into retirement, and lay there a while before the previous night caught up with me fully. I kept waiting to feel triumphant. I never quite did. Standing your ground feels clean in the moment. Losing part of your family, even temporarily, even for reasons you believe in, doesn't feel clean at all afterward. Both of those things were true at the same time, and I had to learn to hold them together without either one canceling the other out. Claire didn't call in July. She didn't call in August either. I kept the shop running at its slower pace, kept teaching 2 afternoons a week at the community college's furniture restoration program, kept fishing the same stretch of creek I always had, thermos in one hand and no particular hurry in the other. Theo started stopping by more often than usual. I think on purpose, though he never said so directly, and he never once brought up that night at the cookout, which I appreciated more than I told him. I thought about calling Claire more times than I'd ever admit out loud. Picked up the phone. Put it back down. Not out of anger by then. Not really. Out of wanting the next conversation, whenever it came, to happen for the right reasons, and not because either of us felt cornered into having it. In August, I got a call from Claire's older cousin, Denise, someone I hadn't spoken to directly in years, who mentioned, carefully, clearly having been asked to test the waters on somebody's behalf, that Claire had been having a hard time since the 4th of July, that she wasn't herself, that maybe I should reach out. I told Denise I appreciated her calling, and that I loved my daughter, and that I wasn't going to reach out first this time, not because I was punishing anybody, but because I needed the next move to come from somewhere real, not from guilt being routed through a relative. I don't know if that was the right call. I still don't fully, but it was the honest one, and by that point honest was the only currency I trusted myself to spend. Part 12. The phone call. In late September, on a Tuesday evening, my phone rang while I was halfway through a plate of grilled trout and watching the weather roll in over the mountains. Her name on the screen. I let it ring twice before I answered. "Hi, Dad," she said. Her voice sounded thinner than I remembered it. Not younger, older, actually. Like something in it had worn down over the summer in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with weight carried. We talked about nothing for the first few minutes. The way people do when the real conversation is still gathering itself somewhere just underneath the surface. The weather. Her job. A minor plumbing issue at their house that had apparently eaten most of August. Then she took a breath I could hear clearly, even over the phone, and said, "I was so angry that night. Humiliated, honestly, in front of everyone we know." "I know," I said. A pause. Then, "I think somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as my dad and started seeing you as a problem to get ahead of. A situation to manage before it turned into a bigger one." She let out a breath that shook a little on its way out. That's an awful thing to admit out loud. I looked out toward the barn, its outline going dark against the last of the evening light. The same barn where all of this had actually started, months earlier, with a man on a stool going through folders that shouldn't have needed going through in the first place. "It is an awful thing to admit," I said. "But I appreciate you saying it, instead of finding some other way around it." She laughed a little, wet and unsteady, the first genuine sound I'd heard out of her in what felt like a very long time. Then she got serious again. "I'm sorry, Dad." 3 simple words. No qualifiers hanging off the end of them. No, but you have to understand. No attempt to spread the blame around the room until it got thin enough for everybody to carry a small piece. Just the words themselves, standing alone. I closed my eyes for a second. Part of me had imagined a moment like this one for months, turned it over in my head at 2 in the morning more times than I'd admit. When it finally arrived, it felt smaller than I'd expected, and somehow more meaningful because of that. We talked for nearly an hour after that. Not everything got fixed in one phone call. Trust never rebuilds at the speed it takes to break. I've come to understand that much for certain. But it was a start, and a start was more than I'd let myself hope for through most of that long, quiet summer. Before we hung up, I told her something I'd been carrying for months, waiting for the right moment to say it plainly, without anger behind it. "You never lost your father, Claire," I said. "But my life was never something for you to manage on my behalf. It never will be. That's not what a family owes each other." She was quiet a second on the other end. Then, finally, "I understand that now. I don't think I did before, not really. I think I do now." Part 13. Thanksgiving. We didn't rush anything after that call. I want to be clear about that, because I think a lot of these stories get told like a single conversation fixes everything. And that's not honest, and I promised myself I'd tell this one honestly or not at all. Claire and I talked on the phone every couple of weeks through October, short calls at first, careful ones. Both of us picking our words like we were walking across a floor we weren't sure would hold our weight. Ryan didn't come up much in those calls, and I didn't push. That felt like its own separate conversation, one that wasn't entirely mine to have. She came out to the shop alone in early November, the first time she'd set foot on the property since the cookout. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before she came all the way in, looking around at the same benches and tools she used to sit among as a kid pretending to sand things. I didn't say anything. I let her look. "It's exactly the same," she said finally. "Some things don't need changing," I said, "even when everything around them does." She helped me finish a chair that afternoon, badly, on purpose, the way she used to, and we didn't talk about the paperwork or the property or any of it. We talked about her job, about a work trip she had coming up, about a recipe of her mother's she'd been trying to get right for years and never quite managed. It was the first afternoon in almost a year that felt like the two of us instead of two people negotiating around each other. Thanksgiving came. And I invited her and Ryan both, the way I always had. And after a long pause on the phone, she said they'd come. Ryan and I haven't had the real conversation yet, the one where he actually says out loud what he said in my yard back in July. I think it's coming. I think he knows it's coming too. And I think some part of him has been dreading it exactly as long as some part of me has been waiting for it. Families don't always move at the pace you choose for them. Mine certainly hasn't. But we sat at the same table that Thursday, all of us, Theo and his family too, and for a couple of hours, at least, it felt less like a negotiation and more like what a table like that is actually supposed to feel like. Part 14. What I've learned from all of it. Renata used to say families are the one thing you can't send back to the shop for repair. You just have to keep working the wood you've got. Warped grain, old cracks, bad glue joints from somebody else's rush job years before you ever got your hands on it, and all. I think about that saying more now than I ever did while she was alive to say it, which I suppose is how these things usually go. I still love my daughter completely. That hasn't changed, and I don't believe it ever will, no matter what else happens between us in whatever years I've got left. But I've learned, slowly and at real cost, that you can love somebody all the way through and still refuse to hand them the keys to your own life while you're still using it yourself. Those two things aren't opposites, whatever it might feel like in the moment you're choosing between them. Most days now, I think they're actually the same idea, just looked at from two different angles, the way a good joint looks different depending on which side of the wood you're standing on. Claire and I still have a long way to go, and some weeks that road feels shorter than others. Some weeks it feels like real, solid progress. A phone call that goes easy instead of careful. An afternoon in the shop that doesn't require either of us to plan out what we're going to say beforehand. Other weeks it feels like we're both still being careful with each other, testing weight on boards we're not fully sure will hold. Either way, when she calls now, I answer because I want to answer, not because I'm afraid of what happens if I let it go to voicemail. That's a better foundation than the one we were standing on before all of this happened. It's slower to build on. It's a great deal sturdier, too, and I've come to believe sturdy is worth more than fast, in furniture and in families both. If you've ever had to choose between protecting someone you love and protecting yourself from the way they'd started treating you, I hope this is some kind of proof that you don't actually have to pick only one of those things. You can hold both at once, the way you hold a joint under clamp pressure while the glue sets. Uncomfortable, maybe, for longer than you'd like, but not permanent and not, in the end, incompatible with the thing eventually holding.